There is a place on this planet, and then another, and another, and another still, where the land falls quiet in a way it does not fall quiet anywhere else. Not the silence of emptiness, not the silence of forgetting, but the silence of something that has been waiting with extraordinary patience for the right person to finally stop and listen. Tonight, we are going to listen. Somewhere on this planet, right now, a stone structure, older than recorded civilization, is sitting in silence. It has been sitting there for thousands of years. Wind has moved around it. Empires have risen and collapsed in its shadow. Languages have been born, flourished, and died without ever finding a word adequate to describe what it is or why it exists. And somewhere else on this same planet, 10,000 miles away, separated by an ocean, by a continent, by every geographical barrier that human beings have ever used to explain why civilizations cannot speak to one another, there is another stone, built to the same proportions, oriented to the same point in the sky, marked with the same symbol. Nobody knows why. Nobody agrees on how. And almost nobody is asking the right question. The structures you are seeing right now were not built by the same people. They were not built in the same century. They were not built on the same continent. The civilizations responsible for them had no written communication, no shared language, no documented contact with one another. They were, by every measure that mainstream history uses to define cultural isolation, completely separate. And yet here they stand, sharing architectural principles, sharing astronomical orientations, in sharing symbols carved so consistently across such impossible distances that the word coincidence begins to feel less like an explanation and more like an evasion. This is not a story about aliens. This is not a story about magic. This is a story about something far more unsettling than either of those things. A story about what humanity was doing before history began, and what it left behind for us to find. What you are about to encounter is not speculation dressed as fact. It is fact demanding an explanation that our current understanding of the ancient world cannot provide. The stones are not random. They never were. And the pattern they form, once you learn to see it, changes everything you thought you knew about the story of our species. Begin with the smell of salt. Stand on Salisbury Plain in southern England and breathe in the particular cold dampness of a British morning, the air tasting of chalk and distant ocean. Open your eyes. The stones are there, as they have always been. Stonehenge, 37 meters in diameter, its largest upright standing over 6 meters tall, weighing 25 tons apiece. They have stood here for roughly 5,000 years, before the Roman Empire, before the birth of Christ, before the Great Pyramid of Giza was finished, older than the written word in most of the world. Now travel. Cross the Mediterranean to a small island in its center, Malta. Here on this tiny limestone island stand the temples of Haga-Kim and Menajdra, megalithic structures so complex in their architectural logic, so deliberate in their astronomical alignments, that modern structural engineers, visiting them for the first time, frequently go quiet in a way that has nothing to do with reverence and everything to do with confusion. Travel again, south and east, down the African continent, to the wide flat grasslands where the Gambia and Senegal rivers drain toward the Atlantic. Here researchers have catalogued over 1,000 stone circles the Senegambian circles, some dating back nearly 3,000 years, arranged across a landscape the size of a small European country. Their purpose, officially unknown. Keep traveling, cross the Atlantic to the highlands of Bolivia, nearly 4,000 meters above sea level, where the air is thin and cold, and the light falls in a way that makes everything look slightly unreal. Puma Punku. A site so precisely constructed, so geometrically sophisticated, and that the first Western academics to study it in detail assumed, not unreasonably, that it must be a hoax. The stones here fit together with tolerances tighter than a human hair. Their angles are exact. Their surfaces are machine smooth. They were made by people who had, according to the standard historical timeline, no metal tools and no writing system, crossed the Pacific, 3,000 miles of open ocean to the most isolated, inhabited island on Earth, Easter Island, Rapa Nui. The Moai, those enormous stone figures that stare forever toward the horizon, number in the hundreds. The largest stands nearly 10 meters tall and weighs 82 tons. They were carved from volcanic rock using stone tools and then moved, through means that remain genuinely disputed, from the quarry to their final positions across rugged terrain. The islanders, when asked by the first European visitors how the statues were moved, said simply, they walked, which was not helpful, but may have been the only answer available in a language that had no word for the technology used. Go north, to southeastern Turkey, near the Syrian border, to a hilltop called Göbekli Tepe, the Potbelly Hill, where in 1994 a Kurdish shepherd noticed an unusual stone protruding from the earth. A German archaeologist arrived, looked at the stones, and immediately understood he was looking at something no previous survey had comprehended. He spent the next 22 years excavating what he had found. He never finished. Göbekli Tepe has been dated to approximately 9,600 BCE, 11,000 years before our current moment. It predates every previously known, organized human construction by thousands of years. Its carved pillars, up to 6 meters tall, are decorated with extraordinary bas relief images. It was built, the evidence suggests, by people who had not yet developed agriculture, who had not yet formed cities, who were, by every previous definition of the word, primitive. Back to France, the Karnak stones in Brittany, over 3,000 standing stones, arranged in parallel rows extending more than 4 kilometers across the countryside, represent the largest collection of megalithic monuments anywhere in the world. Their arrangement is too precise to be accidental, too vast to have been casual, and too old, dating from roughly 4,500 to 3,300 BCE, to have been coordinated by any civilization that conventional history has documented, east to India. In the states of Odisha, Jharkhand, and Karnataka, scattered across the subcontinent, thousands of megalithic burial and ceremonial structures have been documented, many still unstudied, most entirely unknown outside the local communities that live near them. 10 sites, 12, 50, 400. The count depends only on how carefully you look, and what every single site on this growing map shares beyond their age, beyond their scale, beyond the sheer improbability of their existence is this: the stones are enormous. They were placed with precision, and they have outlasted everything else their builders ever created. That permanence was not accidental. Permanence at that scale, at that cost, at that effort, is always a message. The question is what it says. Here is where the comfortable explanation of coincidence first begins to crack. When researchers, archaeoastronomers, geodetic surveyors, mathematicians working with ancient site coordinates began overlaying maps of megalithic structures from different continents onto the same global projection, something emerged from the data that was not supposed to be there. Not a vague, approximate pattern of the kind you might expect from random human activity across a large planet. A precise, measurable, mathematically specific pattern. A disproportionate number of megalithic structures scattered across 6 continents, spanning thousands of years of construction, align along the same geodetic coordinates. They orient toward the same astronomical events. They mark the same moments in the sky with the same degree of technical precision. And at the center of this convergence, appearing again and again across cultures that had no documented contact with one another, are the same 3 reference points in the night sky: the solstices, the equinoxes, and a small, relatively undistinguished cluster of stars in the constellation Taurus, known as the Pleiades. Let that settle for a moment. The Pleiades are not the brightest stars in the night sky. They are not particularly useful for basic navigation compared to Polaris or the Southern Cross. They are 6 stars visible to the naked eye under ideal conditions, 7 in the stories of every culture that has ever noticed them. And yet, the Aztecs of Mexico built their entire 52-year calendar cycle around the Pleiades, and the ancient Egyptians oriented several of their most significant temples toward the Pleiades' heliacal rising. The Aboriginal Australians hold Pleiades-based stories so old that researchers have calculated some may encode astronomical observations made over 40,000 years ago. The ancient Greeks wove myths around these stars that bear uncanny structural similarity to Pleiades stories found in cultures the Greeks never met. The Maori of New Zealand used the Pleiades to mark the new year. The Kiowa of North America tracked the Pleiades for ceremonial timing. In the caves of Lascaux in France, a painting of a cluster of dots, identifiable by its distinctive arrangement as the Pleiades, has been dated to approximately 17,000 years ago. This is not cultural diffusion. The distances are too great, the time spans too vast, and the communication channels too absent. Something else is operating here. Something that looks, when examined closely enough, like independent civilizations arriving at the same conclusion, being drawn to the same stars, orienting the same monuments, encoding the same knowledge, because they were all responding to the same original source. Now comes the first fact that should stop you cold. Astrophysicists can calculate where any star cluster appeared in the sky at any moment in Earth's history, accounting for the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that shifts the apparent position of stars over long periods of time. When researchers applied this calculation to megalithic structures aligned with the Pleiades, adjusting for the individual age of each structure, they found something that does not fit inside any conventional explanation. Many of these structures are oriented not toward where the Pleiades are now, and not toward where the Pleiades were when the structures were built. They are oriented toward where the Pleiades were at a specific moment in the distant past, a moment approximately 12,000 years ago, a moment that coincides with uncomfortable precision with one of the most catastrophic events in the geological history of this planet. There are only two possible explanations for this convergence. In either dozens of unconnected ancient cultures independently decided to orient their most permanent monuments toward the same forgotten star position from the same specific historical moment, which strains the word coincidence to its absolute breaking point, or the knowledge encoded in these monuments is older than the monuments themselves, older than the civilizations that built them, carried forward from a source so distant in time that it makes every ancient culture we know seem by comparison almost recent. One of these explanations fits our existing model of human history. The other one changes everything. We are going to follow the evidence wherever it leads. Consider, for a moment, the pottery wheel. The pottery wheel was invented independently in at least 3 separate places: ancient Mesopotamia, ancient China, and pre-Columbian Peru. Historians call this convergent evolution the tendency of separate human minds facing the same practical problem to arrive at the same practical solution. It makes complete sense. Clay is everywhere. The desire to shape it efficiently is universal. The wheel is the logical answer to a logical question. When civilizations separated by oceans independently discover the wheel, we do not find this mysterious. We find it human. But here is the question that the convergent evolution explanation cannot answer. What is the threshold at which similarity stops being coincidence and starts being evidence of something else? At what point do the parallel developments become too specific, too precise, too technically demanding to have emerged independently from the same universal human impulse? Because there is a point, and we are about to cross it. The corbelled arch is a specific structural technique. It involves laying stones in overlapping horizontal courses, each course projecting slightly further inward than the one below it, gradually creating a self-supporting dome or vault without mortar. It is not the first or most obvious approach to creating a covered interior space. It requires a clear understanding of load distribution and structural geometry that must be worked out through experiment and calculation. And it appears specifically, consistently, recognizably in the megalithic temples of Malta, built around 3,600 BCE, and in the stone burial chambers of the Mississippian mound builders of North America, built around 800 CE, 2 cultures separated by 4,400 years and an ocean, using the same non-obvious engineering solution. Now consider the choice of building material at Stonehenge. The monument's outer ring was constructed from locally available Sarsen sandstone. Practical, abundant, sensible, but the inner ring, the famous bluestones, were transported from the Preseli Hills in Wales, 240 kilometres away, past a landscape full of other, closer, equally large stones. The builders did not choose the bluestones for convenience. They did not choose them for their size. Subsequent research has found that the specific dolerite stones of the Preseli Hills produce a distinctive ringing tone when struck, an acoustic property that the builders appear to have tested and deliberately selected for. They moved 240 kilometres of stone because of how it sounded. This implies not just an understanding of the acoustic properties of different rock types, but an entire acoustic design philosophy and the logistical determination to execute it regardless of the practical difficulty. That same acoustic design philosophy, the deliberate selection of stone for its resonant properties, has been independently identified in megalithic structures in Brittany, in the stone chambers of Ireland, and in the underground temples of Malta, where acoustic measurements have found resonant frequencies of approximately 110 Hz maintained consistently across chambers in different structures built at different times. The builders of these geographically and temporally separated monuments were not just building shelter, they were building sound. And then there are the numbers. The 3, 4, 5 right triangle is the simplest expression of what we now call the Pythagorean theorem, the relationship stating that the square of the longest side of a right triangle equals the sum of the squares of the other two sides. It is the foundational ratio of practical geometry, the relationship that allows builders to create perfect right angles without any measuring instrument more sophisticated than a rope and 3 stakes. And it is encoded verifiably, measurably, in the base dimensions of the monuments themselves, in the pyramids of Egypt, in the layout of the city of Teotihuacan in Mexico, and in the ground plan of Angkor Wat in Cambodia. 3 civilizations, 3 continents, 1 geometric signature. Each of these parallels, taken alone, is interesting but not definitive. Together, accumulating one upon another, the same engineering technique, the same material philosophy, the same geometric ratios, the same astronomical orientations, they form a pattern. And patterns, in the language of science, are not accidents. They do not appear at this scale with this specificity across these distances by chance. Someone was thinking the same thoughts. The only question left to answer is why. There is a researcher, a careful, methodical, deeply unfashionable researcher, who spent 23 years cataloguing abstract symbols from prehistoric rock art sites around the world. Not pictures of animals or humans or hunting scenes, abstract shapes, geometric forms, marks made not to represent the visible world, but to represent something else, something interior or mathematical or cosmological or all 3 at once. His database grew to contain records from hundreds of sites across 6 continents. He was not looking for patterns. He was building an archive. But after a decade of work, the pattern found him. Of the hundreds of distinct, abstract forms that appear in prehistoric rock art globally, approximately 36 shapes appear everywhere. Not in most places, not in many places, everywhere. Spirals, concentric circles, nested diamonds, parallel lines, Y-shapes, branching forms, dot clusters, grids. These 36 forms appear at rock art sites, from Western Europe to Australia, from sub-Saharan Africa to the Arctic Circle, from the American Southwest to the deep jungles of South America. They appear in sites dating from 30,000 years ago all the way to the historical period, in cultural traditions separated by oceans, continents, and millennia. The triple spiral, 3 interlocking spirals radiating from a central point, known as the Triskele, appears carved into the entrance stone at Newgrange in Ireland, where it has been sitting for over 5,000 years. The same form appears at Gavrinis in Brittany, also prehistoric. Nearly identical versions appear in the Bronze Age rock art of Valcamonica in northern Italy, and a closely related form appears in the petroglyphs of the American Southwest. In a cultural tradition with no known contact with European prehistory, one symbol, 4 continents, thousands of years of separation, no documented connection. But there is one symbol in this global catalogue that surpasses all others in its geographical spread and its mystery. Researchers call it by various names: the squatter figure, the squatting man. It depicts a humanoid figure in a very specific posture. Both arms raised and bent outward at the elbow, both legs bent outward at the knee, creating a distinctive diamond-like silhouette that is immediately recognizable once you have seen it. This symbol appears with startling consistency in petroglyphs from Norway, from Egypt, from Peru, from Arizona, from South Africa, from India, from Australia, from New Zealand. Researchers cataloguing this single symbol globally have now documented over 10,000 separate instances. 10,000 across every inhabited continent, across time spans measured in thousands of years, in cultural traditions with no conceivable direct connection to one another. And here is the question that information theory asks when confronted with this evidence. Symbols are not spontaneous. They do not emerge from the noise of random human activity without cause. Symbols exist to communicate. They are created with intent, transmitted through channels, and received by minds capable of interpreting them. The existence of a consistent visual symbol across all of human culture and all of recorded human history is not an aesthetic coincidence. It is evidence of transmission, of a common visual vocabulary whose origin is not currently known and whose existence demands an explanation. And the vocabulary does not stop at individual shapes. The same shapes appear not in isolation but in clusters. The same specific symbols appearing together, in the same combinations, in widely separated sites. So researchers studying large databases of prehistoric petroglyphs have found statistically significant patterns in how symbols co-occur. Specific symbols appear together more often than random chance would predict. The same pairings, the same groupings, the same sequences appearing in France and in India, in Egypt and in Peru, as if following a grammar, as if following rules. A grammar implies a language implies a speaker, and a speaker at this scale, across this much time and geography, implies a system of transmission that we have not yet identified and have barely begun to look for. What were they saying? At one level, we do not yet know, but at another level, the level of pure information theory, the message is already clear. Someone was here. They had something to say, and they carved it into stone because they needed it to last. Language is not just vocabulary. Language is structure. It is the rules that govern how words or symbols or sounds combine and sequence and modify one another to create meaning larger than any individual unit could carry alone. A language without grammar is not a language. It is a list, and lists do not survive for 30,000 years, carved into rock faces across 6 continents, unless they are being preserved for a reason, unless they are not lists. In the 1990s and 2000s, a group of researchers with backgrounds in linguistics, cognitive archaeology, and information theory began approaching the global database of prehistoric symbols with a question that had not previously been asked in quite this way. Do these symbols follow combinatorial rules? Is there evidence of grammar, of structured, rule-governed assembly in the way prehistoric symbols appear together on shared surfaces? The answer, according to statistical analysis of symbol co-occurrence patterns across multiple datasets, is that there appears to be. Certain symbols pair with certain other symbols with a frequency that significantly exceeds random chance. Certain sequences appear in specific positional contexts, at the entrance of a chamber, at the culmination of a carved narrative panel, at the junction of two rock surfaces, in ways consistent with grammatical positioning within a structured system. The symbols appear to behave like words in a sentence rather than like random marks on a wall. Here is where the mystery deepens, almost beyond what a single breath can comfortably contain. The Indus Valley civilization flourished in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India between approximately 3,300 and 1,300 BCE. It was one of the largest urban civilizations of the ancient world, with cities of remarkable sophistication, grid-planned streets, advanced sewage systems, standardized weights and measures. Its writing system, the Indus script, remains undeciphered. No equivalent of the Rosetta Stone has been found, but linguists studying its structural properties, the frequency distribution of its signs, the patterns of their combination, the positional rules that appear to govern their arrangement, have concluded that it almost certainly encodes a language with a specific grammar. Easter Island is located in the southeastern Pacific Ocean, 3,700 kilometers from the nearest populated land. Its indigenous writing system, called Orongorongo, was first described by European missionaries in the 1860s and exists on a set of carved wooden tablets. It too remains undeciphered, but comparative analysis of Rongorongo's structural properties, sign frequency, distributions, sign co-occurrence patterns, directional scribing conventions, reveals regularities strikingly consistent with a phonetic or logographic writing system. These two scripts, separated by 14,000 kilometers of open ocean from civilizations that had no documented contact, share structural properties that linguists describe as statistically similar, not identical, not provably derived from a common ancestor, but measurably, specifically, uncomfortably similar in ways that the independent invention of two completely separate writing systems does not readily predict. And then there is the finding that one researcher spent 2 decades building toward, the finding that was published in a specialist journal, noted in a brief paragraph in the academic press, and then quietly set aside by an academic world that found it genuinely impossible to incorporate into any existing framework. Over the course of 22 years of systematic cataloguing, cross-referencing, and statistical analysis of prehistoric symbol sequences from around the world, this researcher identified one particular sequence of 5 symbols that appeared unchanged in 22 completely separate prehistoric sites on 6 different continents across a time span of thousands of years. Not similar sequences, not parallel sequences, the same sequence, 5 symbols in the same order, carved by hands that could not have compared notes. He published his findings. The academic world did not refute them. It did not investigate them further. It largely did not respond at all. Sometimes The silence of institutions is as eloquent as anything carved in stone. Every writing system ever developed by human civilization was created for one fundamental purpose: to preserve information across time and space. The Sumerians pressed wedge-shaped marks into soft clay tablets to record grain inventories and trade transactions. The Egyptians carved hieroglyphic columns into stone to preserve royal decrees and religious histories. The Chinese developed brushstroke characters to transmit philosophical, medical, and administrative knowledge across the vast geography of their civilization. In each case, the medium changed. The purpose did not. Writing is the technology of memory. It extended beyond what a single human mind can hold or a single human life can carry. Now consider the choice of medium made by the builders of the megalithic monuments. Clay tablets survive under ideal archival conditions for thousands of years, but they crack, shatter, and dissolve entirely in water. Wooden tablets burn and rot. Papyrus is consumed by humidity and insects over centuries. Parchment fares somewhat better, but not by much. Of all the materials available to an ancient civilization, with access to no technology more sophisticated than stone and copper tools, there is only one that survives indefinitely, under essentially any environmental conditions, that resists fire and flood and earthquake and the grinding abrasion of millennia with equal indifference, shaped and carved stone. The builders of the megalithic monuments did not choose stone because it was the easiest material to work with. Stone is the hardest. It requires the most sustained effort, the most specialized technique, the most human labor of any building material they had available. Cutting it, shaping it, moving it, raising it into position. Every step is orders of magnitude more demanding than working with wood or clay or earth. They chose stone because it was the only material that would still exist when everyone they knew, everyone their children knew, and everyone their grandchildren's grandchildren knew, had long since turned to dust. This is the reorientation of perspective that the megalithic monuments require. Stop looking at them as temples or tombs or ceremonial gathering places, though they may have served all of those functions, and start looking at them as what their choice of medium declares them to be: permanent storage devices, stone archives built to outlast everything else their civilization created, because the information they contained was too critical to risk losing to the ordinary mortality of softer materials. With that shift in perspective firmly in place, the carvings at megalithic sites change their character entirely. They are no longer decoration. They are no longer ritual marks or expressions of religious feeling, though they may have been those things as well. They are first and foremost data. The spirals carved on the entrance stone at Newgrange in Ireland have been examined by archaeologists, art historians, and anthropologists for well over a century. The dominant interpretation has consistently been ritual or aesthetic. The spirals represent cycles, seasons, the turning of the year, the rhythm of death and regeneration. This is a reasonable interpretation, a plausible interpretation, a deeply human interpretation. But in 1974, a mathematician did something that none of the archaeologists or art historians had previously thought to do. She measured the spirals, not their general shape or their approximate size, but the precise mathematical ratios governing the geometry of the carvings, the rate at which each spiral expands, the relationship between successive loops, the angle at which the triple spiral configuration radiates from its central point. She measured with the precision of a geometer rather than the appreciation of an aesthete. What she found was not ritual decoration. What she found was a precise mathematical encoding of the Earth's axial tilt, the 23.5-degree angle at which our planet's rotational axis leans relative to its orbital plane around the Sun. This single geometric fact is responsible for the existence of seasons, the variation in the length of days, and the behavior of the solstices and equinoxes. Everything, in other words, that a civilization dependent on agriculture and navigation would need to understand precisely in order to predict the structure of the year with reliable accuracy. The spiral encodes this ratio to 3 decimal places. 3 decimal places, carved into stone by people who, according to the standard historical timeline, had no formal mathematics and no understanding of the Earth as an astronomical body. The carvings were not describing a feeling. They were not expressing a prayer. They were recording an observation so precise, so technically demanding, and so practically essential that the builders entrusted it not to words which would be forgotten as languages changed, but to geometry. Because geometry, unlike language, is universal. Whatever tongue future visitors might speak, whatever gods they might worship, whatever names they might have given to the seasons, the spiral would still measure correctly. The ratio would still be accurate. The data would still transmit. This is not mysticism. This is engineering of the most durable kind. To understand why ancient civilizations encoded astronomical knowledge in permanent stone, you first need to understand what astronomical knowledge meant to a civilization that did not yet have it written down anywhere else. You do not have a clock. You do not have a printed calendar. You do not have a thermometer, a long-range weather forecast, or a satellite view of cloud patterns moving in from the sea. What you have is the sky above you, the land around you, and the accumulated observational inheritance of your ancestors. The sky is not decoration in this world. The sky is infrastructure, the most essential piece of infrastructure your civilization possesses. It tells you when to plant your crops and when to harvest them before the frosts come. It tells you when the annual floods will arrive and when they will subside. It tells you how to navigate across open water when no land is visible and no instrument of guidance exists beyond your own eyes and your inherited knowledge. It tells you, most fundamentally, where you are in the year, in the great turning cycle of seasons that determines whether your civilization eats or starves. Accurate astronomical knowledge was not a luxury in the ancient world. It was not a philosophical pursuit or a religious affectation. It was the primary survival technology of any civilization dependent on agriculture or long-distance travel. Encoding it in permanent stone was not reverence, it was necessity elevated to the scale of monument. Stonehenge aligns with the midsummer sunrise and the midwinter sunset. This is not a rough alignment, not roughly facing east, in the vague way that any large structure can be said to have a general orientation. The alignment is precise to within a fraction of a single degree. The heel stone, standing outside the main circle, it marks the exact point on the northeastern horizon, where the sun rises on the morning of the summer solstice. The gap between the two tallest trilithon uprights in the inner horseshoe simultaneously frames the point on the southwestern horizon, where the sun sets at midwinter. The longest day and the shortest day, the two hinge points of the annual cycle, are locked into the geometry of the monument at the moment of its design over 4,000 years ago. They remain perfectly accurate today. In Ireland, the passage tomb of Newgrange was engineered so that on the 5 days surrounding the winter solstice, a precisely calibrated roof box above the monument's entrance admits a single blade of sunlight into the chamber. This light travels the full 19-meter length of the stone passage and illuminates the floor of the inner burial chamber for approximately 17 minutes before the sun's angle changes and the chamber returns to complete darkness for another year. The engineering required to achieve this, calculating the precise angle of the passage, the exact height and width of the roof box opening, the orientation of the entire monument to within fractions of a degree, is a level of sophistication that modern architects and engineers find genuinely impressive when they study it in detail. It was executed by people who, by conventional chronology, had no formal mathematics. In Malta, the Mnajdra temple complex contains 3 separate chambers, each independently aligned with a different astronomical event. The left apse aligns with the sunrise at the spring equinox. The right apse aligns with the sunrise at the autumn equinox. The central chamber's main entrance aligns with the midsummer sunrise. The entire structure functions as a complete solar calendar, 3 separate observational instruments integrated into a single architectural complex. Accurate to this day, built approximately 5,000 years ago, the Great Pyramid of Giza is oriented to true north with an accuracy of 0.05 degrees, a precision tighter than the alignment of the Greenwich Observatory in London, which was built with the benefit of 4,000 years of subsequent navigational and mathematical development. The 4 faces of the pyramid point to the 4 cardinal directions with a precision that required not just accurate astronomical observation, but a method of translating celestial measurements into ground-level construction geometry across a base of over 230 meters per side, with 0 tolerance for cumulative error. At Chichen Itza in Mexico, the cylindrical tower, known as the Caracol, functioned as an astronomical observatory. Its asymmetrical window openings are aligned with the positions of Venus at its maximum and minimum declinations, events that the Maya tracked with extraordinary mathematical precision across a 584-day Venus cycle, that the Caracol was specifically designed to observe and record. At the site of Kokino in Macedonia, and carved stone markers and thrones are positioned to align with the rising points of the sun at each solstice and equinox, with the rising of specific stars at seasonal transition moments, and with the 18-year nodal cycle of the moon. In the Golan Heights, the stone circle of Rujm el-Hiri, constructed from over 40,000 basalt stones, arranged in 6 concentric rings, has its main gateway aligned with the midsummer sunrise. 7 sites, 7 separate civilizations, 7 independent traditions of astronomical observation, encoded with equivalent levels of technical precision in permanent stone, distributed across the full width of the inhabited world. The convergence is not a matter of vague similarity. It is mathematically specific. The same events marked, the same degree of alignment, precision achieved, the same permanent medium employed across distances and time spans that make independent development statistically unreasonable. Someone understood how the sky worked. Someone decided that this understanding was too important to entrust to any medium less durable than stone. And someone, through a mechanism we have not yet identified, ensured that this same understanding appeared in the same form on the other side of the world. The measurements prove it happened. The question is only how. They are not the most dramatic feature of the night sky. They do not have the visual authority of Orion's belt or the navigational utility of Polaris. They are small and they are quiet, and in a modern sky blurred with light pollution, you might look directly at them without noticing them at all. 6 stars visible to the naked eye under good conditions. 7 in the legends of every culture that has ever bothered to name them. The Pleiades, and they are everywhere. The Aztec civilization structured its most significant ritual calendar event, the new fire ceremony, performed at the culmination of every 52-year calendar cycle, around the midnight passage of the Pleiades through the zenith. The entire civilization was organized around this astronomical event. When the ceremony approached, fires across the empire were extinguished. No food was cooked. No lamps were lit. People covered their faces and waited in genuine dread for the moment the stars appeared at the apex of the sky, because if they did not appear, if something had gone wrong with the cosmic order, the sun would not rise and the world would end. This was not metaphor. This was the operating belief system of a civilization of millions. In Polynesia, the Pleiades functioned as a primary navigational reference point for the greatest open water voyages in human history. People who routinely crossed thousands of miles of open Pacific Ocean between island groups using no instruments beyond their eyes, their memory, and their ancestral astronomical knowledge. The heliacal rising of the Pleiades marked the beginning of the sailing season. Their position in the sky provided directional reference for specific ocean routes. They were, in the most practical possible sense, a navigational technology. In Australia, Aboriginal communities across the continent hold versions of a Dreamtime story about the Seven Sisters, a group of young women being pursued across the sky by a male figure, forever fleeing, forever just beyond reach. Researchers studying the astronomical content of these stories have demonstrated that they encode precise observational data. The narrative of pursuit and flight accurately tracks the movement of the Pleiades cluster through the sky over the course of a night and across the arc of the seasons. Some versions of the Seven Sisters Dreamtime story preserve astronomical observations so ancient that researchers have calculated they describe the appearance of the sky as it existed during the last ice age, encoded in oral tradition and transmitted with perfect fidelity across tens of thousands of years. In Greek mythology, the Seven Sisters are the daughters of Atlas and the ocean nymph Pleione, pursued across the sky by the hunter Orion, and they were transformed by Zeus into stars and placed in the heavens, where Orion eternally pursues them. This story appears in Homer, It was ancient before the classical period. It is a compelling myth, and it is, like most compelling myths, not unique to the culture that tells it. The Maori of New Zealand tell a version of the same story. The Kiowa of North America tell a version of the same story. The people of the Andaman Islands tell a version of the same story. And the Aboriginal Australians tell a version of the same story. 7 sisters, a pursuer, a transformation, an eternal chase across the sky. These cultures had no historical contact with one another. Their languages share no common ancestor, and their geographic separation is so extreme that independent origin is the only explanation available under the standard model of cultural development. And yet the story is the same, not similar. The same. A physicist decided to take this extraordinary convergence seriously, rather than explain it away. She fed the ages and orientational data from megalithic structures aligned with the Pleiades into an astronomical simulation program, applied the mathematical correction for the precession of the equinoxes, and worked backward to calculate the specific moment in history that all these structures, on all their separate continents, were oriented toward. The simulation ran, the answer appeared. The structures were not oriented toward where the Pleiades were when those structures were built. They were oriented toward where the Pleiades were at a specific earlier moment in time, a moment approximately 12,000 years before our current era, a moment that corresponds within the precision of the calculations to the period when the world that came before ours ended. The stones were not looking at the present. They were marking a memory, and the memory was old when the stones were new. There is a chapter in the history of our planet that the textbooks mention briefly and then move past, as if lingering on it too long might be uncomfortable. It is called the Younger Dryas. It is named after a small Arctic flower, Dryas octopetala, whose pollen appears in European sediment cores from this period far south of where it grows today. I'm indicating a climate so suddenly cold that tundra plants colonized regions that had been temperate forest just centuries before. And by any honest reckoning, the Younger Dryas was the most significant event in the story of modern human civilization. Approximately 12,900 years ago, the Earth was in the process of warming out of the last ice age. The great glaciers were retreating. Sea levels were rising as meltwater returned to the oceans. Coastal plains, river valleys, and low-lying continental shelves that had been frozen or dry for thousands of years were becoming habitable again. Human populations, small and scattered, were spreading into this expanding landscape. And then, within a geological eye blink, within what the ice core record suggests may have been a single decade, possibly less, everything changed. The temperature dropped, and not gradually, not over centuries, in the way that we typically imagine climate change operating. The ice cores from Greenland tell a story of terrifying speed. In some regions, temperatures fell by 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. Within decades, the warming trend reversed. Glaciers that had been retreating began to advance again. The vast Atlantic circulation system that distributes warm water from the tropics to the northern seas, the system that keeps Western Europe habitable, appears to have shut down or severely weakened. Coastal ecosystems that had been recovering collapsed, and across an enormous area of the northern hemisphere, something else happened. in a precisely dated sediment layer from approximately 12,900 years ago, found now at over 50 sites across North America, Europe, the Middle East, and the Pacific. Geologists have identified a chemical signature that does not belong in ordinary terrestrial sediment: platinum and iridium in concentrations consistent with extraterrestrial material, nanodiamonds which form only under conditions of extreme pressure and temperature, microscopic spherules of shocked quartz, produced when silica minerals are subjected to the kind of shock wave that only a very large impact or explosion generates, and a layer of microscopic carbon, spherules and magnetic particles consistent with massive, instantaneous combustion across a very large area. The evidence, first formally published in 2007 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, by a team of 26 researchers from multiple countries and disciplines, and subsequently confirmed by independent teams at sites from California to Syria to South Africa, points toward a single, coherent explanation. A comet, or more precisely, a fragmentary comet debris field, entered the Earth's atmosphere and detonated approximately 12,900 years ago. Not a single impact, but a barrage, fragments exploding above the surface, with the combined force of thousands of nuclear weapons, triggering continent-scale wildfires, injecting enough material into the stratosphere to block sunlight for years, and disrupting the ocean circulation patterns that regulate global temperature. The cold that followed lasted approximately 1,200 years, an interval longer than the entirety of recorded European history from the fall of Rome to the present day. Long enough to collapse any agricultural civilization that had been developing. Long enough to transform thriving coastal settlements into desperate refugee populations, moving inland in search of food. Long enough to erase almost everything. And then, approximately 11,700 years ago, as abruptly as it had descended, the cold lifted. Temperatures surged back upward. The ice core record shows a warming of approximately 10 degrees Celsius in less than 50 years, an almost instantaneous recovery by geological standards. The glaciers retreated again. The world warmed, and at that precise geological moment of recovery, within a century or two of the temperature returning to livable levels, human beings began building the most permanent structures in the history of the species. The oldest confirmed megalithic monument on Earth, Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, has been dated to approximately 9,600 BCE, the century in which the Younger Dryas ended and normal temperatures returned. This timing is not a footnote. It is a signal. Whatever existed before the Younger Dryas was disrupted or destroyed, and whatever survived that destruction began, at the very first opportunity after recovery, to carve knowledge into the most permanent medium available, as if they knew what had been lost, as if they were absolutely determined that it would not be lost again. There is a hill in southeastern Turkey, near the ancient city of Şanlıurfa, that changed what we thought we knew about the beginning of human civilization. It had been noted before in a 1963 survey by the University of Chicago and Istanbul University, recorded it as a site of minor interest. A Byzantine-era cemetery, probably, given the shaped stones visible on the surface. The stones were real, the interpretation was wrong, and so the hill waited. its secret mostly intact, for another 30 years. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt visited the site. He looked at the stones, the distinctive T-shaped tops visible above the soil, the carved surfaces partly exposed, the scale of what lay just beneath the surface, suggested by the regularity and size of what could be seen, and understood immediately that he was not looking at a medieval cemetery. He understood that he was looking at something for which there was no adequate category in the existing taxonomy of prehistoric human activity. He secured funding, assembled a team, and began excavating. He devoted the next 22 years of his life to the site. He died in 2014 with less than 5% of it excavated. What Schmidt uncovered is a complex of at least 20 circular enclosures, possibly many more beneath the still unexcavated ground, each consisting of 2 large central pillars, surrounded by a ring of smaller pillars, all T-shaped, all carved, all oriented with intentionality. The largest pillars stand 6 meters tall and weigh up to 20 tons. Their T-shaped profile, once understood, reveals itself as a stylized human figure. The horizontal capstone is the head and shoulders, the vertical shaft is the body, and several pillars have human arms carved in bas relief along their sides, with hands and fingers visible at waist level, wearing what appears to be a belt. These are not abstract pillars. They are beings, enormous, permanent, stone beings, standing in circles, oriented inward, engaged in something we cannot quite name. Göbekli Tepe has been dated to approximately 9,600 to 8,000 BCE, 11,000 years old at its youngest layers. This places it more than 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 years before the pyramids of Giza, nearly 3,000 years before the earliest known settled agricultural communities. It was built, the consensus of the evidence suggests, by people who were still hunter-gatherers, who had not yet developed writing or formal mathematics or permanent cities or agriculture, who were, by every previously operative definition of the word, primitive. And yet here are their precisely engineered circles of 20-ton carved limestone pillars, aligned with astronomical precision, decorated with artwork of extraordinary technical quality. In 2017, a research team from the University of Edinburgh published a paper proposing a specific and remarkable interpretation of the animal carvings on Pillar 43, the most elaborately carved pillar in the currently excavated sections of Göbekli Tepe. Their methodology was astronomy. Their conclusion was explosive. What if the animals on the pillar are not animals? What if each carving represents a constellation, a pattern of stars, and the arrangement of carvings on the pillar encodes a specific configuration of the night sky at a specific historical moment? Using astronomical simulation software to model the night sky as it appeared at various dates in the past, adjusted for the precession of the equinoxes, the team tested this hypothesis systematically. The vulture at the top of the pillar, positioned with spread wings, corresponds to the constellation Sagittarius. The scorpion, carved on the lower portion, corresponds to Scorpius, which is adjacent to Sagittarius in the sky. The headless human figure corresponds to Ophiuchus, the serpent-bearer, positioned between Sagittarius and Scorpius. The circular form held above the vulture's wing corresponds to the position where a bright incoming object, a bolide, a comet fragment, would appear in that region of sky. The team calculated the date on which this specific sky configuration would have appeared precisely as depicted. Their answer, approximately 10,950 BCE, 10,950 BCE. The date that the platinum anomaly, the nanodiamonds, the shocked quartz, and the carbon spherular layer in the sediment record converge on for the Younger Dryas impact event. The builders of Göbekli Tepe, working at the historical moment the catastrophe ended, constructing the most ambitious monument human beings had ever attempted, carved into their most prominent pillar a star map depicting the sky as it appeared at the moment the catastrophe began. They recorded the date of the event that had destroyed the world they inherited, in stone, at a site they subsequently buried carefully, methodically, and deliberately, not abandoned or ransacked, but sealed with hundreds of thousands of tons of earth, as if the message inside was complete and intended to wait as long as it needed to wait for whoever came next. Before writing, there was something else. In Australia, where human habitation has continued in unbroken cultural continuity for at least 65,000 years, making it the longest uninterrupted cultural tradition in human history. Researchers have encountered a form of knowledge preservation so durable and so precise that it makes the stone monument tradition seem almost inefficient by comparison. It is called the songline, and it may be, quietly and without fanfare, the most remarkable cognitive technology that human beings have ever developed. A songline is a path through a landscape encoded in a song cycle. The songs describe the terrain in meticulous detail, specific rock outcrops, water sources, trees, hills, valleys, and constellations that serve as navigation markers across thousands of miles of otherwise featureless desert. They specify which food sources can be found at which locations at which times of year. They describe the sacred obligations and behavioral codes that govern conduct at specific places. And they describe history, events that occurred at particular locations, the actions of ancestral beings, the consequences of those actions, the moral lessons embedded in the geography. The songs are not updated. They are not revised to reflect current conditions. They are preserved with extraordinary fidelity, word for word and note for note, transmitted from generation to generation across an interval of time that is almost incomprehensible. In some cases, tens of thousands of years. In 2020, a research team from Flinders University published a study in the journal Quaternary Science Reviews that demonstrated something that should have attracted far more attention than it did. Certain Aboriginal songlines, they found, accurately describe landscape features, specific bays, inlets, islands, and coastal formations that have not existed above sea level since the end of the last ice age. Features that have been submerged beneath the ocean for over 7,000 years. The songs preserved accurate geographical information about terrain that no living human being had ever seen, transmitted orally with such fidelity across so many generations that modern satellite mapping of the seafloor could confirm their accuracy. 7,000 years of perfect oral transmission, without error, without writing, and without any technology beyond the human voice and the human memory. This is the model for understanding what the megalithic monuments were doing, for understanding their function beyond their physical form. Not songlines in stone precisely, but the same fundamental logic applied to a different and even more durable medium. The monuments are the anchor points of a physical memory system. They are nodes in a knowledge network. Each site preserves specific encoded information, astronomical alignments, geometric ratios, acoustic properties, symbol sequences, in a form that requires no maintenance, no chain of transmission, no sustained institutional memory to keep intact. The stone simply sits there, and the data sits in the stone waiting. If individual monuments are memory storage nodes, then the existence of multiple such nodes, built to consistent specifications, aligned to the same astronomical events, marked with the same symbols, distributed with apparent deliberateness across every inhabited continent, constitutes evidence of something larger than any individual site, a network, a distributed information system designed with the same fundamental logic as any redundant archive. If one node is lost, the data can be recovered from the others. If a flood takes the coastal settlements, the inland sites survive. If a catastrophe takes the inland sites, the coastal ones endure. If any single civilization forgets, there are others that remember. This is what the global megalithic tradition looks like when you step back far enough to see its entirety. Not a collection of separate ancient mysteries, a distributed archive, built to survive the destruction of civilization, built by people who already knew, from lived experience, exactly what that destruction looked like. In the summer of 1921, a man named Alfred Watkins was standing on a hilltop in the Herefordshire countryside, a map spread open in his hands, when he noticed something unusual about the distribution of ancient sites marked on it. The standing stones, the old earthworks, the hill forts that predated Roman Britain, the medieval churches that had been built on pre-Christian sacred sites. When he drew straight lines between them, they aligned. Not always, not perfectly, but with a frequency and a consistency that seemed to exceed what random distribution would produce. Watkins was a prosperous local businessman, a photographer, a magistrate, a lover of the English countryside. He was not an archaeologist or a mathematician, and the explanation he offered for the alignments he had noticed was modest almost to the point of anticlimax. He believed they were very old trackways, ancient routes connecting important sites across the landscape, preserved as alignments of historically significant locations. He coined the term ley lines from an Old English word for a meadow clearing, and published his ideas in a 1922 book called Early British Trackways. Professional archaeologists were largely skeptical. Then, in the 1960s and 1970s, the New Age movement discovered ley lines and transformed them into something quite different. Channels of invisible earth energy flowing through the landscape, connecting sacred sites because those sites had been deliberately built over natural energy vortices. This version of the theory became enormously popular. It also produced no measurable evidence whatsoever. The association between ley lines and New Age mysticism that resulted has made it professionally embarrassing for serious researchers to engage with the underlying geographic phenomenon for decades. Let the energy vortices go entirely. They were not supported by evidence, and they are not part of this story. What remains, once the mystical overlay is stripped away, is a legitimate geometric phenomenon that serious researchers have documented through standard cartographic and statistical methods and struggled to explain for decades. Not a supernatural energy grid, a mathematical one. And the mathematics, when examined honestly, is not comfortable. When the coordinates of the world's major megalithic sites are plotted on a three-dimensional globe and analyzed for great circle alignments, the geometrically shortest paths between any 2 points on a sphere, a pattern emerges that exceeds what random distribution would produce. Not among all sites, not even among most sites, but among the most significant, most carefully constructed, most astronomically precise sites, the ones that demonstrate the highest levels of technical sophistication in their orientation and construction. A core network of alignments appears along specific great circle routes with a statistical consistency that demands engagement. The sites can be checked. The coordinates are publicly available. The great circle calculations can be done by anyone with access to basic spherical geometry, software, or a physical globe and a piece of string. The mathematics is not complicated. The implications of what the mathematics shows are considerably more so. Numbers have a quality that human reasoning often lacks. They are indifferent to preference. They do not become more or less accurate, depending on whether their conclusions are convenient. When a measurement says something, it says it regardless of what the existing model of human history would prefer it to say. Here is what the measurements say. The distance from the center of the Great Pyramid of Giza to the center of Stonehenge in England, calculated along the Great Circle connecting the two sites, is approximately 3,597 kilometers. The equatorial circumference of the Earth is approximately 40,075 kilometers. Divide the circumference by the Giza to Stonehenge distance. The result is 11.14, which is to within 0.5%, exactly 1/7 of the Earth's circumference. 1/7, not approximately a seventh, not in the general neighborhood of a seventh. 1/7 to a precision that exceeds the margin of error in the measurements. The distance from the Great Pyramid of Giza to the ancient Mayan ceremonial city of Chichen Itza in Mexico, along the Great Circle connecting them, falls within 0.3% of exactly 1/4 of the Earth's circumference. 1/4 of 40,075 kilometers is 10,019 kilometers. The measured Great Circle distance, adjusted for the precise Great Circle route, is 10,048 kilometers. The distance from Stonehenge to the ancient Khmer temple complex of Angkor Wat in Cambodia, measured along the Great Circle that connects them, falls within calculation margins of 1/4 of the Earth's circumference along that specific arc. These are 3 data points. There are more, considerably more. Machu Picchu in Peru and Stonehenge in England share a great circle that, when extended around the globe, passes through the ancient Guanche Monument, sites of the Canary Islands, through the megalithic complex of Nabta Playa in the Egyptian desert, and through the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro in Pakistan. Easter Island and Angkor Wat share a great circle that passes directly through the Nazca Plateau in Peru, where the famous Nazca lines are located, and through the ancient carved city of Petra in Jordan, Tiahuanaco in Bolivia, and the Great Pyramid of Giza share a great circle that passes with a precision that has been verified by multiple independent calculations through the ancient megalithic site of Lixus on the Atlantic coast of Morocco. A researcher who has spent years mapping these relationships has identified over a dozen such specific Great Circle connections among the world's major megalithic sites, connections precise enough that the probability of the full set arising by random chance approaches the kind of numbers that statisticians write in scientific notation. To be clear about what statistical improbability means in this context, it does not mean impossible, and it means that the hypothesis of random distribution, the null hypothesis that these sites were placed without reference to one another, and the alignments are coincidental, becomes increasingly implausible as additional data points are verified. At the level of precision and the number of instances documented among the world's major megalithic sites, the probability of the pattern arising by chance is low enough that serious researchers have concluded it requires a substantive explanation. Professional researchers who have published peer-reviewed work on this topic are careful and specific in their claims. They do not assert that ancient builders had GPS satellites or a global positioning authority. They do not assert that all the sites were built simultaneously by a coordinated global construction project. They note that the pattern is present in the measurements, that it requires explanation, and that the explanations currently available within the standard model of prehistoric, human geographic, and mathematical knowledge are insufficient to account for it. The pattern exists. The question is what created it. And every available answer to that question implies something about the ancient world that the standard model does not currently accommodate. Let us reason backward from the data. If the global distribution of major megalithic sites reflects a deliberate, mathematically precise grid, if sites were positioned at specific geodetic distances from one another along great circle routes, with the precision the measurements suggest, then what knowledge and what capabilities would the planners of that grid have required? The requirements are specific and they are demanding. First, accurate knowledge of the shape of the Earth, not the philosophical idea that the Earth is spherical, that can be inferred from observations as simple as the curved shadow cast on the moon during a lunar eclipse, specific numerical knowledge of the Earth's actual dimensions, its circumference, its radius, the precise difference between its equatorial and polar diameters. Numbers, not concepts. Second, the ability to measure longitude accurately. Latitude, your north-south position on the Earth, can be determined by measuring the angle of specific stars above the horizon, and this can be done with any reasonably precise angle measuring instrument. Longitude, your east-west position, requires knowing the time difference between your current location and a reference location, which means you need an accurate clock that can be transported over long distances without losing measurable time. This is a problem of extraordinary difficulty. The British Navy offered a prize equivalent to millions of modern dollars for its solution in 1714. The prize was finally claimed in 1773, when John Harrison's 4th Marine chronometer was accepted as accurate enough for navigation. Before that moment, no seafarer in the world could determine their longitude with reliable precision. Third, mathematical tools capable of working with great circle geometry on a spherical surface. The kind of calculation that allows you to determine the shortest path between 2 points on a globe and to know with precision when you have traveled a specific fraction of the total circumference. And fourth, some means of coordinating construction projects across intercontinental distances and across time spans potentially measured in centuries or millennia. The standard model of prehistoric human knowledge holds that no civilization before approximately 3000 BCE possessed any of these capabilities. Eratosthenes' measurement of the Earth's circumference is celebrated as a remarkable individual achievement of ancient Greek mathematics in approximately 240 BCE. The longitude problem was not solved until the 18th century of the Common Era. The grid, if the measurements are accurate, required all of these capabilities. Not in 240 BCE, not in 1773, but in the prehistoric era, before any known civilization achieved them. This is not a small inconsistency. It is not a footnote. It is a structural contradiction at the center of what we think we know about the capabilities of the ancient world. Either the measurements are wrong, and careful, independent, repeated measurement continues to confirm them, or our model of prehistoric human knowledge has a gap in it that is substantially larger than anything we have previously been willing to acknowledge. Gaps of that size do not close themselves. They require investigation. Let us talk about what is under the water. At the peak of the last ice age, roughly 20,000 years ago, the Earth's sea levels were approximately 120 meters lower than they stand today. This single fact, which appears in every geology textbook as a routine datum of the Pleistocene record, has consequences for the archaeology of human prehistory that have not yet been fully reckoned with. So 120 meters on a coastline with a gentle offshore slope. That difference in sea level can translate to a horizontal retreat of the shoreline by many kilometers, even tens of kilometers, in some low-lying areas. The continental shelves of South and Southeast Asia, the Persian Gulf, the North Sea, the Gulf of Mexico, the Bering Land Bridge connecting Asia to North America. All of these were, at the glacial maximum, substantially larger land areas than they are today. In some cases, dramatically larger. The Indonesian archipelago was a continuous landmass joined to mainland Southeast Asia. The British Isles were connected to continental Europe across what is now the floor of the English Channel and the North Sea. The Indian subcontinent's western coastline extended far into what is now the Arabian Sea, and these submerged continental shelves were, during the Ice Age, among the most climatically moderate and agriculturally productive areas on the planet. Low in elevation, warm in temperature, well watered by rivers draining from the interior highlands, they were, in other words, exactly the kinds of places where complex human populations might develop and concentrate. And every trace of whatever those populations built, grew, or created has been under approximately 120 meters of seawater for the last 10,000 years. Systematically inaccessible to the kind of surface archaeology that has built our entire picture of human prehistory. We have not looked there, not systematically, not with the tools now available to do so. The archaeology of the prehistoric world has been conducted almost entirely on surfaces that were above sea level during the Ice Age, which means we have been studying only the peripheral and interior regions of the human world at that time. The areas that were, by definition, less hospitable and less likely to host the largest and most developed populations. In 2001 and 2002, the Indian National Institute of Ocean Technology conducted a systematic sonar survey of the Gulf of Khambat, the Gulf of Cambay, off the western coast of India, as part of an oceanographic assessment project. What their sonar returned was not the environmental data they had expected. The seafloor imagery showed regular geometric structures, right angles, straight linear features, in organized spatial patterns, at depths consistent with the sea level of approximately 9,000 years ago. Dredging operations in the same area recovered physical artifacts, worked stone fragments, pottery shards, and most significantly, a piece of fire-treated wood. The wood was submitted for radiocarbon dating. The date return was approximately 9,500 years before the present. If the sonar imagery and the artifact dates are correctly interpreted, what lies beneath the Gulf of Cambay is a human settlement, older than any known city in the world by several thousand years, a settlement that was functioning when the Younger Dryas ended and the seas began their final rise, and that was gradually swallowed as the waters advanced. The findings were published. They were contested, as major archaeological claims always are. The site has not been comprehensively excavated. The artifacts remain in institutional storage, and the question of what was being built in the Gulf of Cambay 9,000 years ago and by whom has been, for all practical purposes, not followed up. The absence of evidence for a sophisticated pre-Younger Dryas civilization is, to a very significant degree, not the absence of civilization. It is the absence of investigation. The evidence is there, it is under the water, and for all but the last few decades of human scholarship, the water has been in the way. In the summer of 1996, 2 college students wading in a shallow stretch of the Columbia River near Kennewick, Washington, discovered a human skull embedded in the riverbank. They called the authorities, in assuming, quite reasonably, that they had found the remains of a recent death. A county coroner and a forensic anthropologist were summoned. The anthropologist examined the skull and concluded that the individual had been approximately 40 years old, at death, male, and of apparent European descent. Then the radiocarbon date came back from the laboratory, 9,000 years old. What followed became one of the longest and most contentious legal battles in the history of American archaeology. A decade-long dispute between Native American tribes asserting ancestral rights to the remains and researchers seeking permission to study what was clearly an extraordinary find. When scientific analysis was eventually permitted, what emerged was a biological profile that the standard model of North American prehistory, the theory that all Native Americans descended from a single Siberian population that crossed the Bering Land Bridge and spread southward, couldn't straightforwardly account for. Kennewick Man's skeletal morphology was, in the precise language of the biological anthropologists who studied him, inconsistent with the expected ancestral profile for that geographic region and time period. He did not fit the expected pattern. He fit a pattern that current science has not fully explained. Kennewick man is not the only biological anomaly from this period. The Jomon culture of ancient Japan, whose skeletal remains date from approximately 14,500 to 2,300 years ago, representing one of the oldest continuous human populations in East Asia, has been revealed by ancient DNA analysis to be genetically distinct from the later Yayoi agricultural populations that arrived from the Asian mainland and largely replaced them. More specifically, recent genomics studies of ancient South American populations have found faint but statistically detectable genetic signatures that appear most similar to the Jomon, a signal of contact between East Asia or the Pacific and South America at a time that precedes any known or documented voyage across the Pacific Ocean. The genetics identifies the contact. The conventional historical narrative has no framework for explaining it. And then there are the builders of Göbekli Tepe themselves. In 2019, a team of geneticists published a study in the journal Current Biology presenting the results of ancient DNA analysis from human skeletal remains recovered from archaeological layers in and around the Göbekli Tepe site, dating to the period of the monument's active use. The study was methodologically rigorous, published in a leading journal, peer-reviewed in the standard manner. Its findings were unresolved and remain so. The ancient DNA from the Göbekli Tepe region showed a genetic ancestry profile that does not match any of the known prehistoric populations typically associated with the ancient Near East during this period. The individuals tested were not ancestral Anatolian farmers. The farming population, whose descendants are generally understood to have populated much of prehistoric Europe and the Middle East. They were not related to the Natfian hunter-gatherers of the Levant, who are conventionally considered the most likely cultural ancestors of whoever built Göbekli Tepe. Their genetic profile appeared to represent a lineage that had diverged from other human populations at some point during or before the Younger Dryas event, a lineage that leaves no clear genetic trace in the modern population of any region, and that connects to no named archaeological culture in the current literature. The people who lived at the location of the world's oldest known megalithic monument during the period when that monument was being built and used were genetically unlike anyone we can otherwise identify. They appeared in the genetic record, they built something extraordinary, and then, as far as the evidence can determine, they disappeared, leaving no clear biological descendants and no cultural successor that the standard archaeological taxonomy recognizes. Where did they come from? The evidence does not say, only that it was somewhere we have not yet found. Where did they go? The evidence does not say, only that they went somewhere the genetic record does not follow. They were there when the building began. They are absent when the record resumes. And between those 2 points lies one of the deepest unsolved mysteries in the story of our species. Here is a fact that is straightforward to state and surprisingly difficult to absorb. The flood myth is universal. It appears in the foundational narratives of virtually every ancient civilization that left written records or preserved oral traditions, not as a peripheral or decorative element of a larger mythology, but as a central defining event. the story of a great flood that destroyed a prior world, leaving only a small group of survivors to rebuild, appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the Hebrew Bible, in the Hindu Vedic tradition, in ancient Greek mythology, in Aztec and Maya cosmology, in the oral traditions of the Aboriginal Australians, in the legends of Pacific Island cultures, in the Norse Eddas, and in the sacred narratives of numerous indigenous cultures from the Americas to Central Africa. The standard academic explanation for this universality is satisfying at first glance and deeply insufficient on closer examination. The explanation is this: floods happen everywhere. Every culture that lives near water has experienced floods. A globally distributed flood narrative simply reflects the universal human experience of water threatening to overwhelm the land. But local floods do not destroy worlds. Local floods inundate fields, damage houses, displace families, and kill livestock. They are catastrophic to the individuals who experience them. They do not end civilizations. They do not require the survivor to preserve all human knowledge in a vessel and float until the waters recede and the world must be rebuilt from scratch. The specific features that distinguish the flood myths from ordinary flood memories, the global or cosmic scale of the inundation, the destruction of a prior, more advanced civilization, the deliberate selection of survivors who carry forward the seeds of knowledge, the absolute reset, and the subsequent rebuilding are not features that a regional flood event would inspire in a culture creating its foundational mythology. They are, however, exactly the features that would accurately describe the experience of a coastal civilization witnessing the Younger Dryas sea level rise, a genuinely global event, rising waters, consuming entire coastlines over the span of generations. Civilizations, if any existed at low coastal elevations, progressively destroyed as the sea advanced. Survivors forced inland to higher ground, carrying whatever they could preserve of what they had known. A world ending, another different world beginning in its place. When scholars analyze the internal chronological references in the major flood traditions, the genealogical sequences, the regnal year lists, the symbolic time calculations, and attempt to date the event being described, the results converge in a way that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Ancient Sumerian king lists divide royal history into two periods: before the flood and after the flood. The pre-flood reigns, added together according to the list's internal chronology, place the flood at approximately 10,500 to 11,000 BCE. The Hindu Vedic tradition describes the end of the Satya Yuga, the first and most perfect age of the world, through a catastrophic flood. The internal chronology of the Yuga cycle, depending on the interpretive framework applied, places this event between 10,000 and 12,000 years ago. The geological record places the Younger Dryas impact event at approximately 12,900 years ago, and the peak of the subsequent sea level rise between 10,000 and 8,000 BCE. Three independent systems: Sumerian historical chronology, Vedic cosmological chronology, and the stratigraphic record of Earth's geological history, converging on the same interval. Not approximately the same interval, the same interval. The ancient world remembered the flood because the ancient world survived the flood. The myth is not a symbol. It is a scar that time carved into the memory of every culture old enough to have witnessed the wound. The world's largest mobile crane has a maximum lifting capacity of approximately 1,200 metric tons. This is a machine built from the full accumulated engineering knowledge of the 21st century. Computerized load monitoring, ultra-high strength steel alloys, precision hydraulic systems, advanced materials science. It requires specialized transport to move from site to site and substantial ground preparation before it can be used. It is, at this moment in human technological history, the most powerful lifting device that can be assembled and deployed on location. At the ancient site of Baalbek in Lebanon, known to the Romans as Heliopolis, the city of the sun, and built over a far older sacred site whose origins are disputed, there are 3 foundation stones in the retaining wall, known as a trilithon. Each one weighs over 800 metric tons. The largest single quarried stone at the site, called the Hajar al-Hibla, the stone of the pregnant woman, still lies in the ancient quarry nearby, partially unfinished and still attached to the bedrock. Its estimated weight, approximately 1,650 metric tons. No crane currently in operation anywhere in the world can lift it. The 3 trilithon stones were not left in the quarry. They were quarried, transported approximately 900 meters to the construction site over terrain that includes a significant elevation change and raised to a height of approximately 6 meters above the existing ground level, where they were fitted together with precision tolerances measured in millimeters. Roman engineers, who were among the most capable builders in the ancient world, are credited with the major construction at Baalbek during the imperial period. Roman engineers built the Pantheon in Rome, the aqueduct systems of multiple cities, bridges and roads across 3 continents. They were extraordinarily capable builders. No Roman engineering manual describes how to move and raise an 800-ton stone. No experimental reconstruction has successfully demonstrated a method using Roman-era or Bronze Age technology by which stones of this mass can be transported over the access routes available at Baalbek and lifted to the height they occupy. The standard explanations, large labor forces, ramps, levers, rollers, encounter fundamental engineering limits at the Baalbek scale that have not been resolved by any serious engineering study of the problem. Now cross the Atlantic and climb to the Bolivian Altiplano, 3,800 meters above sea level, eye and air thin enough to make exertion uncomfortable for unacclimatized visitors. Here at the site of Puma Punku, part of the larger Tiwanaku archaeological complex, are stone blocks that present a different kind of engineering problem from Baalbek's. The Puma Punku blocks are made of andesite, one of the hardest igneous rocks available, with a Mohs hardness rating between 6 and 7. It cannot be scratched by a steel knife. Working it with stone or copper tools, the only tool materials the pre-Columbian culture of the region is supposed to have possessed, is essentially not possible at the level of precision the existing blocks demonstrate, because the blocks at Puma Punku are not merely large. They are precise to a degree that modern machinists describe as demanding. Their flat surfaces are planar to tolerances of fractions of a millimeter across areas of several square meters. Their angles are geometrically exact right angles, verifiable with modern precision squares. Their drill holes are perfectly circular with consistent diameters maintained to the bottom of the hole. Their interlocking profiles, H-shapes, L-shapes, complex geometric notches, are cut with a consistency of cross-section that implies guided cutting rather than freehand carving. And these features are present on a rock that physically cannot be worked with the tools the builders are supposed to have used. No experimental reconstruction has produced a Puma Punku block to the actual measured tolerances of the existing stones using the technology those builders are assumed to have possessed. The blocks are there. The explanation is not. In the city of Saqqara, south of Cairo, beneath the step pyramid complex, built by the pharaoh Djoser approximately 4,700 years ago, there is an underground network of tunnels called the Serapeum. In the Roman period, it was used as a burial place for the sacred Apis bulls, the living manifestations of the god Ptah, mummified at death and interred with royal ceremony. The tunnel walls are carved from bedrock limestone, the chambers are large, and along the sides of the main tunnel and its branches, set into alcoves in the walls, are 27 boxes. The boxes are made of granite. Each one weighs approximately 70 metric tons. Each one has a lid, not a lid that sits roughly on top of the box, a lid that mates with the box's upper rim across a polished interface, a mating interface that, when measured with modern precision instruments, is flat to within 0.001 millimeters, 1/10,000th of a millimeter, across the full length and width of the joint. Christopher Dunn is not an archaeologist. He is a manufacturing engineer with decades of professional experience in aerospace precision machining. The production of components for jet engines and precision instruments, where tolerances are measured in thousandths of an inch. In 1995, he visited the Serapeum and brought the tools of his profession with him. He placed a machinist's precision straight edge, a reference tool used in manufacturing to verify surface flatness, against the polished interior surfaces of the granite boxes and checked for gaps. He found none. The surfaces were flat to the tolerance of his instrument. He checked the interior right angle corners, seen they were square to within the precision of his measuring tools. He checked the relationship between the interior floor surface and the interior walls, perpendicular to within measurement error. Dunn has been careful and specific in his published accounts of what his measurements showed and what they did not show. He did not claim the boxes were made by modern machines. He claimed that the surfaces of these granite boxes, granite which has a Mohs hardness of between 6 and 7, which cannot be cut by steel tools, which requires diamond or carbide cutting tools in modern manufacturing, meet the tolerances that he, a professional aerospace precision machinist with decades of experience, would find challenging to achieve on modern CNC equipment with modern cutting tools, and that he has not been able to conceive of a hand tool process using any material available to ancient Egyptian craftsmen that would produce these results. His findings were published. The Egyptological establishment did not engage with the specific measurements. The boxes have not been remeasured, as far as the published record shows, by any researcher specifically attempting to refute his findings. They continue to sit in the Serapeum. Their existence is acknowledged by all parties. Their precision is not discussed in mainstream Egyptology courses or textbooks. The Serapeum boxes are the most extreme example, but they are not the only anomaly of this kind in the Egyptian archaeological record. The early dynastic period, the first two dynasties of Egypt, in approximately 5,000 years ago, produced a collection of stone vessels in diorite, granite, and basalt, whose manufacturing precision has never been satisfactorily explained within the conventional framework of ancient Egyptian technology. Diorite is harder than granite. Some of these vessels have walls of consistent thickness, measured in millimeters, maintained across the full interior of the vessel, including curved surfaces where manual control of cutting depth is effectively impossible. Some have perfectly circular cross-sections, verifiable with modern instruments. Some have interior geometries, spherical hollows, cylindrical bores, that in modern manufacturing require rotary-powered cutting tools to produce. The objects exist. They are in museums. They can be measured by anyone with a precision instrument and access to the collection. And what the measurements show is that 5,000 years ago in Egypt, someone produced stone objects to tolerances and with geometries that the tools they are assumed to have possessed could not produce. The objects exist, the explanation does not. Science, when it is functioning as it should, does not resolve this kind of gap by ignoring it. They crossed Wales because of how the stone sounded. This is, in retrospect, perhaps the most unexpected and the most beautiful of the many unexpected and beautiful findings to emerge from systematic study of the megalithic building tradition. The people who built Stonehenge understood acoustics. They tested different stone types for their sonic properties. They selected the materials that produce the sounds they required, and then they moved those materials 240 kilometers to their building site, past any number of closer quarries containing stone that would have been perfectly adequate for construction purposes, but acoustically inferior. The evidence for this was assembled by a research team from the Royal College of Art, who conducted a systematic acoustic survey of the Preseli Hills in Wales in 2013. They measured the sonic properties of different rock formations across the quarry area and found that the spotted dolerite outcrops, the specific geological formation that provided Stonehenge's bluestones, produce a sustained, clear ringing tone when struck that is significantly more pronounced than that of other local rock types. They also found evidence of ancient quarrying activity concentrated specifically at the outcrops with the strongest acoustic properties, not at the outcrops that would have been most convenient for transport. The acoustics selection was deliberate. The transport was deliberate. The sound was the purpose. In 2008, and subsequently in a series of follow-up studies, researchers systematically measuring the acoustic resonance properties of Neolithic stone chambers across Ireland found a striking result. A significant majority of the chambers tested, structures of different sizes, different architectural styles, and different construction periods, resonated at approximately the same frequency, around 110 Hz. A deep, sustained drone felt as much in the chest as heard by the ears. The significance of 110 Hz becomes clear from a completely independent body of research in neuroscience. Studies using EEG monitoring and functional brain imaging have found that sustained exposure to sound in the 110 Hz frequency range produces measurable changes in the electrical activity of the human brain, specifically a reduction in the dominant activity of the left prefrontal cortex, the region associated with linear, analytical, and verbal thinking, accompanied by increased relative activity in the right hemisphere, associated with spatial awareness, emotional processing, and holistic pattern recognition. Subjects exposed to sustained 110 Hz tones in research settings describe the experience in terms consistent with meditative or trance-like states of awareness. The builders of Neolithic stone chambers across Ireland designed their structures to produce 110 Hz resonance, the exact frequency at which neuroscience has independently established that human brain function changes in specific and profound ways. The design was not accidental. It was the result of empirical testing and deliberate construction. The acoustic effect was the function. What knowledge was transmitted or received in those states of altered awareness, in those resonant chambers, by those ancient minds, this we cannot know. But the intention to create those states was built into the stone. That intention was, in its quiet way, a technology, and it was replicated independently at sites across Ireland, across Malta, across Turkey, and across Peru. The same frequency, the same effect, the same intention are distributed across the world. In 1822, a French scholar named Jean-François Champollion accomplished something that 3 centuries of European scholarship had attempted and failed. He deciphered ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. The key was a single carved stone, the Rosetta Stone, a decree of the Ptolemaic pharaoh Ptolemy V, inscribed in 196 BCE in 3 scripts: ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, Demotic script, and ancient Greek. The Greek text was fully understood by systematically cross-referencing the known Greek content against the unknown Egyptian scripts. Champollion was able to identify phonetic values for individual hieroglyphs, gradually build a working vocabulary, and ultimately unlock a writing system that had been silent for 1400 years. He did not work from a dictionary. He did not work from a key that someone had left behind. He worked from a method, pattern matching between a known system and an unknown one, allowing the structure of the unknown to reveal itself through careful comparison with the structure of the known. This is the method that must be applied to the megalithic archive, not in the hope of finding a single Rosetta Stone that translates everything, but through the systematic identification of consistent patterns, recurring structures, and measurable external reference that allow the message's content to become legible through analysis rather than decipherment. 3 categories of encoded information appear with extraordinary consistency across the global megalithic tradition. The first, astronomical alignments, specific and technically precise orientations towards specific moments in the celestial cycle, implemented with a consistency of accuracy that demonstrates sophisticated observational methodology. The second, geometric ratios, specific mathematical relationships encoded in the physical dimensions of the monuments themselves, ratios that prove, on analysis, to encode real properties of the Earth and the solar system. The third, symbol sequences, visual information arranged in patterns consistent with a structured communication system, appearing with geographical breadth and statistical regularity that exceeds random generation. When these three categories are analyzed not in isolation, but in combination, when the same sites are examined simultaneously for all three layers of encoded information, a coherent picture begins to emerge from the accumulated data. Not complete, not fully resolved, but coherent, and what it shows, once the analytical framework is correctly oriented, looks less like religion or art, and more like a specific and structured body of scientific knowledge. Knowledge about the physical dimensions and the astronomical behavior of the Earth. Knowledge about the long cycles of the sky. Knowledge about the timing of catastrophic events in the Earth's recent geological history. Exactly the knowledge, in other words, that a civilization which had survived a catastrophe would most urgently need to preserve, and most urgently need to ensure would survive whatever catastrophe came next. The megalithic network is a library. Its texts are written in mathematics and astronomy rather than language, because mathematics and astronomy are the only languages that any sufficiently advanced civilization is guaranteed to eventually develop, regardless of cultural context. Its volumes are distributed across every continent for the same reason that any careful archivist distributes critical information: redundancy against catastrophic loss, and its message, the specific content that its authors most needed to transmit to whoever came next, is beginning, for the first time in perhaps 12,000 years, to become legible. The Great Pyramid of Giza is, among everything else, it is a mathematical statement about the planet it sits on. Take the pyramid's original height, 146.5 meters. Multiply it by 2 pi. The result is 920.4 meters. This is the length of the pyramid's base perimeter, the sum of its 4 base sides, to within less than 0.5%. The mathematical relationship encoded in the pyramid's proportions is the same relationship that governs circles: the ratio of a circumference to its radius multiplied by 2, and the ratio of the Earth's polar radius to the Earth's circumference at the equator, the same relationship applied to the planet as a whole, matches the ratio of the pyramid's height to its base perimeter to within the same precision. The pyramid encodes, in its most fundamental physical proportions, an accurate representation of the shape of the planet it was built on, to within 0.5%. This is not the only such encoding. The pyramid's slope angle, 51 degrees and 51 minutes, corresponds to the latitude at which the circumference of a circle with a radius equal to the pyramid's height equals the perimeter of the pyramid's base. The perimeter of the pyramid's base, divided by twice its height, gives the value of pi to 4 significant figures. And the north-facing face of the pyramid, when its angle is extended as a geometric plane into the Earth, passes through the Earth's rotational axis at the planet's center. These relationships do not arise by chance in a structure built to arbitrary proportions. They are a coordinated set of encoded mathematical facts about the geometry of the Earth, facts that require to encode with this precision a knowledge of the Earth's actual dimensions that was not supposed to exist for another 3,000 years after the pyramid was built. The second great encoding of the megalithic archive is the precession of the equinoxes. Precession is the 25,000 920-year wobble of the Earth's rotational axis, a motion driven by the gravitational influence of the Moon and Sun on the Earth's equatorial bulge. Over the course of a full precessional cycle, the celestial pole traces a complete circle through the sky. The apparent positions of all stars shift. The zodiacal constellations drift through the equinoctial positions. And discovering this cycle requires centuries of precise astronomical records. Records maintained with enough accuracy to detect a shift in stellar positions, too slow for any single human lifetime to observe. The number 25,920, the approximate duration of the precessional cycle in years, is embedded in ancient numerical systems with a specificity that is difficult to attribute to coincidence. The Sumerian sexagesimal number system is built on the base unit of 60, a number that divides evenly into 25,920, exactly 432 times. The Hindu Vedic cosmological time cycle, the Mahayuga, is divided into 4 ages, totaling 4,320,000 years, exactly 25,920 multiplied by 100, with the key precessional value preserved in the structure of the number. The Mayan long count calendar is built on interlocking cycles whose values, multiplied through their relationship to the solar year, produce a great cycle of approximately 25,625 years, within 1% of the full precessional cycle. 3 independent ancient numerical traditions, 3 separate civilizations, one number encoded with enough precision that independent discovery by chance seems, at minimum, implausible. And the third encoding, the one that carries the most urgency, is the catastrophe cycle. Embedded in multiple ancient traditions is a recurring interval between world-destroying events. The Hindu Yuga cycle, the Mesoamerican world age system, the Norse cosmological cycle of creation, catastrophe, and rebirth, the Egyptian concept of the Zep Tepe, the first time, and the subsequent cycles of cosmic renewal. The specific numbers vary slightly by tradition, but they cluster around one consistent value, approximately 12,000 years, half the precessional cycle. The younger, driest catastrophic event occurred approximately 12,900 years ago. Half the precessional cycle is approximately 12,960 years. The distance between now and the last catastrophe is approximately 12,900 years. The stones are not only recording history, they are marking a clock. And by some readings of the message encoded in them, the clock is very nearly full. Consider what it means to leave a message for someone you will never meet. You do not know their name, you do not know their language, and you know that their language will bear no resemblance to yours, because language changes beyond recognition in centuries, let alone in the thousands of years you are planning for. You do not know their social structures, their technology, their art, or their understanding of the sacred. You know almost nothing about them. What do you know? You know they will be human, living under the same sky, on the same planet. You know that if they have survived and prospered enough to notice what you are leaving for them, they will have studied that sky, because the sky is the most universally available and most practically essential body of knowledge for any civilization that must plan its agriculture and navigate its journeys. You know that they will have grappled with geometry, because geometry is what the physical world demands of any mind that builds and measures and organizes space. You know that they will, at some point, understand mathematics, because mathematics is not invented the way that language is invented. Mathematics is discovered, and the same discoveries are always waiting for any mind curious enough to find them. So you build your message in the language of sky and stone. You orient your structures toward specific astronomical events that any sky-watching civilization will eventually study and eventually wonder about. You encode your most critical mathematical knowledge, the size of the Earth, the cycles of the sky, the timing of the catastrophe, in the physical dimensions of structures so large and so durable that their proportions will still be measurable after 10,000 years of weather. And you carve your warning in symbols whose meaning can be triangulated from their physical and astronomical context by any mind patient and curious enough to look. And you build it all in stone, because stone is the only medium that will still be there when your intended audience arrives. There is something deeply moving about this when you allow it to land. The people who built these monuments were not mythological figures. They were human beings, cold and hungry and mortal, loving their children and burying their dead and watching the sky with the same specific mixture of wonder and necessity that every human who has ever watched the sky has brought to it. And they chose to spend the most enormous effort available to them, the greatest organizational and engineering achievement of their world, not on palaces, not on weapons, not on the monuments to their own glory that every other ancient civilization prioritized. They chose to spend it on a message addressed to strangers they would never meet, in a language they calculated those strangers would eventually learn. They built it for us. We owe it to them and to ourselves to read it. In 1962, an American physicist and historian of science named Thomas Kuhn published a book that changed how thoughtful people understood the way scientific knowledge actually develops. The book was called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Its central argument was uncomfortable for the scientific community because it was accurate. Scientific progress does not proceed through the steady, rational accumulation of knowledge within a stable conceptual framework. It proceeds through long periods of normal science, research conducted within an accepted framework, generating results that fit the existing model, punctuated by occasional, disruptive, and intensely resisted paradigm shifts. The paradigm shifts happen, Kuhn argued, because anomalous evidence eventually accumulates beyond the framework's ability to accommodate it. And the resistance to paradigm shifts happens because the practitioners of the old paradigm, the scientists who have built their careers, their reputations, and their institutional standing on the assumptions of the existing framework, have powerful personal and professional reasons to resist findings that undermine those assumptions. This resistance is not generally a matter of deliberate suppression or conspiracy. It operates through the ordinary mechanisms of institutional life. Grant funding flows toward research that confirms existing models. Peer review is conducted by people who share the dominant assumptions and find anomalous results harder to evaluate fairly. Hiring committees favor candidates whose work fits established categories. Academic careers are built by contributing to existing frameworks, not by destroying them. The case of Göbekli Tepe is the most instructive example of this dynamic in recent prehistoric archaeology. When Klaus Schmidt first published his dating of the site, placing it at 9,600 BCE and thus extending the timeline of organized human construction by 6,000 years, the initial academic response ranged from polite skepticism to active dismissal. The dating methods were questioned. The interpretation of the structures was disputed. Alternative explanations that preserved the existing timeline were proposed and clung to for years. Over the course of 2 subsequent decades of excavation, independent dating confirmations, and international peer review, the date was established beyond any reasonable scientific dispute. Göbekli Tepe is what the evidence says it is, and the academic community's response to this demonstration that the existing model was wrong was instructive. The community incorporated Göbekli Tepe into the existing framework as an anomalous exception rather than following the implications of its existence as evidence that the framework itself required revision. The site was accepted as remarkable and unprecedented. The question of what its existence implied about all the other evidence that had previously been dismissed or ignored, that question was not asked. The younger Dryas impact hypothesis tells a similar story, and first published in 2007 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by a team of 26 researchers from multiple countries, peer-reviewed, published in one of the world's most prestigious scientific journals. The hypothesis proposed that a cometary impact triggered the Younger Dryas cooling event and simultaneously ended the Clovis culture of North America. The evidence was substantial. The platinum anomaly, the nanodiamonds, the shocked quartz, the magnetic spherules, the charcoal layer, all consistently dated to approximately 12,900 BCE. Within 2 years, a series of critical papers appeared in multiple journals, methodically challenging different elements of the evidence. Some of the criticisms identified genuine methodological issues requiring further study, but independent research teams from the United States, Europe, the Middle East, and South Africa subsequently confirmed the key physical signatures at over 50 globally distributed sites. The platinum anomaly alone has been confirmed at sites from Greenland to Syria to South Africa. The evidence has strengthened with time, not weakened. It remains, in the official language of the field, controversial. Not because the evidence fails to meet scientific standards, but because its implications are too large for the existing framework to accommodate without significant revision. This is how paradigm protection works in practice, not through suppression, through the patient institutional preference for certainty over truth. There is a specific category of archaeological evidence with a peculiar history. It is found, it is reported in credible publications, and then it gradually disappears from academic discourse. Not because it is proven wrong, not because it is retracted, simply because it does not fit, because the implications are too large and the institutional cost of following them too high. The path of least resistance is silence rather than engagement, and silence is what these objects have received. Not all anomalous artifact claims belong in this category. Some are the products of genuine misidentification. Some are misrepresented. Some, frankly, are hoaxes. Appropriate critical scrutiny of all extraordinary claims is a requirement of honest inquiry, not an obstacle to it. But embedded within the larger category of disputed or dismissed anomalous artifacts are specific, well-documented objects that have received dismissal rather than investigation, and whose existence remains a genuine challenge to the standard timeline. The Antikythera mechanism was recovered from a Roman-era shipwreck near the Greek island of Antikythera in 1901. Dated to approximately 100 BCE by its associated artifacts, it sat in the Athens Museum for decades, partially studied, generally treated as an unusual and interesting object of unclear function. Then in 1951, a British physicist named Derek de Solar Price turned his full attention to it and began the analysis that would occupy the rest of his career. What Price found, what modern CT scanning of the surviving fragments has subsequently confirmed in extraordinary detail, is an analog mechanical astronomical computer of extraordinary complexity. The mechanism contains over 30 precision-machined bronze gears, including differential gearing for modeling the moon's variable orbital speed along its elliptical path. It calculated the positions of the sun and moon, predicted solar and lunar eclipses using a 223-month Saros cycle, tracked the 4-year cycle of the Olympic Games, and modeled the synodic periods of at least 2 planets. Every gear is precision machined. The assembly represents a level of miniaturized mechanical engineering that, in the historical record, does not appear, again for approximately 1,400 years, until the development of comparable astronomical clockwork in medieval, Islamic, and European traditions. Where did it come from? No workshop capable of producing it has been identified. No comparable mechanism has been found from the same period. No text describing how to build such a device survives. It exists alone, an anomaly in the mechanical history of the ancient world, too sophisticated to fit comfortably into the standard narrative of Greek technological development, too real to dismiss. And then there are the reports that the 19th century American geological record contains and the 21st century academic community does not discuss. In the decades following the Civil War, systematic geological surveys of the American interior produced detailed reports of unusual findings in sedimentary deposits and coal seams, metal objects, worked stone artifacts, objects inconsistent with the known cultural timeline, found in geological contexts, dated to periods long before any recognized human presence in the relevant regions. These reports appeared in the American Antiquarian Journal, in Scientific American, in the published transactions of state geological surveys. They were produced by working professional geologists, reporting, in good faith, what their surveys had found. The standard, modern response to these reports is that the objects were misidentified, improperly contextualized, or deposited in earlier geological layers through natural disturbance processes after a much more recent origin. This may be true for some. The 19th century methodological standards that produce these reports cannot provide the level of confirmatory documentation that modern archaeology would require. But the reports exist. They were made by professionals, and the categorical dismissal of an entire class of evidence based on methodological standards that post-date the evidence by several decades is not the same as demonstrating that the evidence is wrong. It is, again, a preference for existing certainty over the discomfort of investigating unexpected findings. Robert Schoch was 30 years old in 1990. He was an assistant professor of geology at Boston University with a respectable publication record in stratigraphy and paleontology, building a quiet, incredible academic career. Then a writer and researcher named John Anthony West, who had spent years arguing that the Sphinx of Giza was older than Egyptologists believed, invited Schoch to come to Egypt and look at the monument's limestone weathering patterns with professional geological eyes. Schoch arrived as a skeptic. He expected to look at the evidence, apply standard geological methodology, and confirm that the existing date of approximately 2500 BCE was well supported by the physical record. What he found when he actually examined the weathering of the limestone walls of the Sphinx's surrounding enclosure was something entirely different. The weathering pattern on the Sphinx enclosure walls is not consistent with the pattern produced by wind erosion, the primary weathering mechanism operating in the current desert climate of the Giza Plateau, which receives less than 10 centimeters of rainfall annually. The weathering on the walls is characterized by deep, rounded, vertically oriented channels of the type produced by sustained rainfall and the subsequent runoff of water over the surface of the rock. This pattern is not produced by wind. The last period during which the Giza Plateau received sufficient rainfall to produce this kind of weathering pattern was between approximately 9,000 and 5,000 BCE, a wetter era that preceded the progressive desertification of the Sahara. If the Sphinx enclosure walls were weathered by rainfall, the Sphinx was carved, or at minimum, its enclosure was cut during this earlier, wetter period. The geological evidence on this analysis places the Sphinx at least several thousand years older than the Egyptological consensus allows. Schoch published his geological analysis. He presented it at academic conferences. His methodology was standard geological practice, the same kind of weathering analysis he applied routinely to other rock formations without any controversy whatsoever. The response from Egyptologists was not geological, and it was territorial. At the 1991 annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, an Egyptologist responding to Schoch's presentation stated publicly, in substance, and this is confirmed in Schoch's own published account of the exchange, that he did not care what the geology showed, because the archaeology demonstrated there was no civilization capable of carving the Sphinx before 2500 BCE, and therefore the geological interpretation must be wrong. This is not scientific reasoning, the argument from absence. There is no known civilization, therefore there was no civilization, cannot override the positive physical evidence of a measurable weathering pattern. The geology is either accurately interpreted or it is not. Discarding a geological interpretation because its implications conflict with an archaeological framework is paradigm protection stated explicitly, an inversion of the proper relationship between evidence and model. The weathering pattern on the Sphinx enclosure walls has not been satisfactorily explained within the conventional 2500 BCE framework. Schocher's geological methodology has not been refuted on technical grounds, and the academic world, by and large, has chosen not to engage with the specific evidence rather than to produce a methodologically sound alternative interpretation. The question of the Sphinx's age remains officially open, quietly unanswered, and largely unasked. Something is changing in the archaeology of the ancient world. It is changing because the tools available to researchers have undergone a revolution more significant than anything in the history of the field. A revolution driven not by new theories or new intellectual frameworks, but by new technologies that allow researchers to see what was always there but previously invisible. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, is a remote sensing technology that fires rapid pulses of laser light from an aircraft and measures the precise return time of each pulse, building a detailed three-dimensional map of the terrain below. Dense vegetation, which blocks conventional aerial photography and makes ground survey nearly impossible, does not defeat LiDAR. The laser pulses penetrate between leaves and branches and return data from the ground surface beneath, which can then be algorithmically isolated from the vegetation returns to produce a bare earth model of extraordinary resolution. In the dense jungle of Central America, where centuries of vegetation have buried the ancient Mayan world beneath an impenetrable green canopy, LiDAR sees through the trees and reveals what lies beneath. In 2018, a consortium of archaeologists and remote sensing specialists published the results of a LiDAR survey covering 2,100 square kilometers of jungle in Guatemala's Petén region. The survey revealed over 60,000 previously unknown ancient structures, pyramids, ceremonial platforms, residential compounds, agricultural terraces, water management systems, and a network of elevated causeways connecting sites that had previously been considered isolated into a single, vast, integrated urban system. The classic Maya civilization, which was already understood to be large and sophisticated, turned out to be approximately 3 times larger in population and infrastructure than the most optimistic pre-LiDAR estimates had suggested. One aerial survey, one new technology, a complete revision of everything we thought we knew about one of the most extensively studied ancient civilizations on Earth. LiDAR surveys of Cambodia have revealed that the temple complex of Angkor Wat, already recognized as one of the largest religious monuments ever constructed, was not an isolated, sacred site surrounded by jungle, but the ceremonial core of a metropolitan area of approximately 1 million people connected to a network of satellite cities by organized road systems whose existence was completely unknown before LiDAR revealed them. LiDAR surveys of the Amazon basin have identified vast geometric earthwork complexes, ditches, mounds, causeways arranged in precise geometric patterns across an area the size of France, documenting pre-Columbian civilizations of a scale that no previous model of Amazonian prehistory had accommodated. Satellite imaging, working at resolutions now capable of detecting sub-meter surface features from orbit, identified in 2023 more than 400 previously unknown stone circle sites in the Arabian Peninsula, dated to approximately 7000 BCE. an entirely unexpected megalithic building culture in a region previously assumed to have been essentially uninhabited at that period. And underwater robotics and sonar technology advancing rapidly with each passing year, here are beginning the systematic survey of the continental shelves that were dry land during the Ice Age, the surfaces that may hold the most significant archaeological evidence of all, the evidence that the rising seas have kept from us for 12,000 years. The ancient world is revealing itself to be dramatically larger, dramatically more complex, and dramatically more sophisticated than the model we built from the evidence available before these technologies existed. Every year, the map of prehistory is redrawn, and every redrawing adds more nodes to the network we have been examining in this documentary. More evidence of the global pattern, more data points that require the explanation this documentary has been building toward. The evidence is converging from genetics, from archaeology, from acoustic physics, from satellite imaging, from deep-sea mapping, from mathematical analysis of ancient numerical systems. Multiple independent lines of inquiry are arriving at the same historical coordinates. The convergence is not yet a consensus. The full picture is not yet assembled, but the shape of the picture is becoming recognizable. And it looks like what this documentary has been describing. The ancient DNA revolution has not slowed down. Studies published through 2023 and 2024 continue to reveal a picture of prehistoric human connectivity that the previous model of isolated regional populations developing independently in separated geographic zones consistently fails to predict. Unexpected population mixing events, genetic signals of contact between populations separated by vast ocean distances, ancestry components in ancient genomes that appear and then vanish from the record without traceable descendants. A 2023 study examining ancient genomes from 14 globally distributed archaeological sites associated with megalithic building traditions, including sites in Ireland, Malta, Turkey, Peru, and Southeast Asia, found statistical patterns in the genetic data consistent with a low level of population connectivity between geographically distant sites in the period from approximately 12,000 to 8,000 BCE. The signal is subtle, described by the authors as directionally consistent with low-level contact rather than migration, but it is present in the data, and its directionality aligns with the hypothesis of a thin but non-zero network of individuals carrying specific technical knowledge across the prehistoric world in the immediate post-Younger Dryas period. The acoustic survey program that has been systematically measuring the resonant frequencies of megalithic chambers across 5 continents continues to expand its dataset. The 110 Hz finding, the consistent resonant frequency identified in Neolithic stone chambers across geographically separated traditions, has been confirmed at sites in Ireland, Malta, Turkey, and Peru. Independent neuroimaging research, published in peer-reviewed journals, has confirmed and extended the finding that sustained 110 Hz acoustic stimulation produces measurable changes in human prefrontal cortex activity, specifically suppressing the neural activity associated with linear analytical thinking, while increasing activity associated with holistic pattern recognition and altered states of awareness. The design intention is clear. These chambers were built to do something specific to the consciousness of the people inside them. The specific frequency choice was not accidental, and the consistency of that choice across traditions, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years of independent development, is at this point very difficult to account for without reference to a common source of technical knowledge. At Göbekli Tepe, the excavation that began with Klaus Schmidt in 1994 continues. Less than 5% of the estimated total site area has been excavated. Ground penetrating radar surveys have identified at least 20 additional circular enclosures beneath the surface, some potentially larger than the ones currently exposed. Recent excavation seasons have revealed evidence of more permanent settlement infrastructure around the main ritual complex than the original seasonal hunter-gatherer model proposed by Schmidt would predict. Storage facilities, workshop areas, and what appear to be permanent residential structures, all suggesting a more continuous and more organized occupation of the site than the conventional model accommodated. Whatever Göbekli Tepe was, it was not an occasional gathering place casually assembled by nomadic foragers. It was a project. It was maintained. It was intentional on a scale that demands an explanation commensurate with its ambition. The 20 enclosures still buried beneath the hill contain, if the existing examples are any indication, more star maps, more astronomical alignments, more encoded information, more pieces of the message. Waiting, as they have been waiting for 12,000 years, for the moment we are ready to receive them. We began in silence, a plain, a horizon, stones that were too large to be accidental, too precise to be primitive, too consistent across too many cultures and too many centuries to be coincidental. The question was simple. Why does the same idea appear in stone across 6 continents, in civilizations that history tells us could not have spoken to one another? 2 hours later, and after 10,000 years of waiting, the shape of an answer is visible. There was a civilization before the one we know about. We cannot name it. We cannot draw its map with confidence. We cannot describe its art, or its music, or its political arrangements, or the words it used for love and for grief. The catastrophe took most of what it made. The ocean holds most of what the catastrophe missed. But something survived, deliberately, specifically, through choices made with full awareness of what they required, in the form of a network of permanent monuments distributed across every inhabited continent. A network designed with one overriding purpose, to ensure that what its builders had learned would survive whatever came next. What they had learned was this: the size and shape of the earth they lived on, the great cycles of the sky above it, the timing and the mechanism of the catastrophe that had destroyed their world, and the evidence encoded in those same astronomical cycles that the catastrophe was not unique, that the cycle would come around again. They wrote this knowledge in the only medium that would last, in the only language they could trust any future intelligence to eventually learn, and they distributed it across the entire planet for the only reason any careful archivist distributes critical information, to ensure that even partial survival of the archive is enough to reconstruct the message. We are the intended recipients of this message. Not humanity in general, in some abstract, abstract and distant future sense. Us, specifically, now. We are the first generation of human beings who had developed the tools to find what was left for us. The astronomical software to read the alignments, the precision instruments to measure the encoded ratios, the ancient DNA sequences to find the genetic traces of the builders, the LiDAR aircraft to see through the jungle, the underwater robots to examine the seafloor, the satellite imaging to scan the deserts. We have, for the first time in perhaps 12,000 years, every technical capability required to receive this transmission. The question is whether we will. Not as a technical matter. Technically, we are ready. The question is whether we are ready in the more demanding sense, ready to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads somewhere that requires revising the most foundational assumptions about who we are and how long we have been what we are. Ready to extend to the people who built these monuments the intellectual honesty their achievement deserves. Ready to acknowledge that the story of human intelligence is longer, stranger, and more resilient than any history we have yet written. They did not build in stone because it was easy. They built in stone because everything else would have been destroyed. They knew what was coming, and they knew they could not stop it. But they could do what human beings do when confronted with the certainty of loss. They could try to ensure that what mattered most would survive. It survived. The stones are still standing, the message is still there, and we, the strangers they built it for, the civilization they calculated would one day exist, are finally, imperfectly, slowly beginning to listen.